Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth, along with its expansion pack Rising Tide for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a 4X turn-based strategy game developed by Firaxis and published by 2K in October of 2014 for PC, and it would later see release on Mac and Linux the following couple of months, and the expansion pack Rising Tide was released in October of the following year. And it occupies a bit of an odd spot in the Civilization franchise because it's definitely not a sequel to Civilization 5, and it's not really related to Civilization 6 either. It's just its own standalone title, and they sort of intended it as a spiritual successor to the classic Alpha Centauri, but using the engine that powered Civilization 5 as well as a bunch of the mechanics that they used in Civilization 5 to give it its own spin on things. And the reception was generally quite lukewarm, myself included, when I got a chance to play Civilization Beyond Earth a while back. It just ended up being seen as something of a standalone expansion to Civilization 5, and people who were very big fans of Alpha Centauri generally found it lacking in almost every regard. And to make matters worse, they pulled a Civilization 5 with it, in the sense that they released it with some pretty bare-bones mechanics, and it did have quite a few glitches in it as well, so they had to patch it to get some of those glitches out, and eventually the Rising Tide expansion came out in an attempt to sort of fix what was wrong with the base game. And it does certainly make quite a few changes to the mechanics and add a bit of content to the game, but whether or not it does fix those problems is another matter entirely. So let's go ahead and actually start delving into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here as a whole. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is more or less on par with what you saw in Civilization 5, which at its time was actually quite a good looking game. And even to this day, both Civ 5 and Beyond Earth still look actually quite good, considering that they are turn-based strategy games. If you keep that in mind, then you understand that graphics aren't really the main selling point here, and they can get away with a bit, but they still have done a very good job with modeling textures, animations, and making sure that everything has a suitably sci-fi look in Beyond Earth. There's even a nice visual touch that has your units changing their appearance as you go further and further into a specific affinity, so if you go down the Harmony line, for example, your units are going to look different than if you went down the Supremacy line or the Purity line. And that's a nice visual touch. It does help to differentiate them a bit, at least. And that is something worth mentioning because the factions themselves generally look pretty much the same. Oh sure, they might have a different color for their units, and they might have different place names, but all of their settlements look the same, all of the units look the same as one another, and the only real differentiation you get on any noticeable level is when you go into diplomacy with these factions, and they have their own specific faction leader that dresses in a specific way and speaks a particular language. Now sure, you do get a fair bit of that in the main historically based Civilization games as well, but as of more recent entries in the series, they've definitely tried to differentiate that quite a lot, with different unit graphics and city graphics on top of the fact that the various faction leaders have their own specific personalities, and they are historically grounded figures, and that just makes them more relatable. But then when you get to Beyond Earth and you look at the various factions, you find that they're more or less just kind of boring. I mean, what differentiates Polystralia from the corporation Ark? Well, I mean, the fact that one of them is a corporation and one of them is a group of nations, but there's also the main thing being that the Polystralian leader has an Australian accent, or a New Zealander accent, I'm not entirely sure which, I can't very easily differentiate the two. And the leader of the Ark faction speaks with an American accent. You know you're talking to Franco-Iberia because the leader of that faction speaks French. You know you're talking to INTEGR because the leader of that faction speaks German, so on and so forth. It just means that you don't really end up with a lot of personality with the various factions, and with the lack of unit graphics changing except in the case of affinities, and everybody can have the same affinities by the way, it means that you don't really get a whole lot of uniqueness to the visuals, even though it does at least do a good job with the sci-fi aesthetic. So while there is certainly a uniqueness problem with the visuals, they've generally done a pretty good job with making sure that the visual quality is up to par. And when you move over into sound design, you find that, generally speaking, they've done a good job with that as well. Sound effects do exactly what they need to, but don't really do anything more than that. While the voice acting is serviceable, but nothing particularly impressive. I mean, I've already mentioned that the various faction leaders don't really have a whole lot of personality to them, and the voice acting itself ends up reflecting that quite a bit. But then you move over into the soundtrack and you find that the music in this is definitely very fitting for a sci-fi game. And in particular, it's a style that's pretty reminiscent of what you would find in a full-on space opera, so it ends up working out pretty well for the game in the long run. And when you bring all of the sound design together, even though it does certainly have a few issues here and there, most of it's actually quite solid, and it does contribute to what is ultimately a pretty solid presentation all around, although it does have some issues with blandness here and there. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, or I should say the lack of story in this, because the story in this concerns a bunch of factions leaving Earth and trying to find a new home in the stars after Earth effectively becomes uninhabitable. And that's really it. There's nothing setting up why the factions are the way they are, what their general philosophies are, any of that. All it really gives you is what that faction is centered around mechanically and a very bare-bones blurb about the leader and what they're all about, but that doesn't really even tell you what the leaders are about. Sure, it gives you a vague idea of what they used to be like, but you find out once you actually get into the game proper that it seems like all of the personality traits of all of the leaders are randomly generated. This brings me to mention one of the earliest mechanics you'll run into, which is the personality trait system. His personality traits include things like what your faction actually starts with in terms of bonuses, and as you continue through the game, you can eventually get access to new traits that will add on top of that. So for example, if you get the spacefaring trait, then you get increased duration for orbital units, or if you get refined, then it increases the culture yield of your cities, or if you get disciplined, then it means that your military units gain experience points faster. They all provide tangible bonuses, and they're actually a feature of the Rising Tide expansion rather than the base game. And it also introduces the new resource that Rising Tide comes with, called Diplomatic Capital. You can use Diplomatic Capital to purchase various trade agreements with other factions or to purchase personality traits, and you can even use it to purchase units and buildings if you have enough of it, and it's generated through trade, through various diplomatic agreements that the other factions propose to you, and of course certain buildings that you can construct that also produce it as they do with other yields. Now you're probably wondering why I'm talking about Rising Tide mechanics before I even get to the base game, and that's because once you install Rising Tide, it completely overhauls all of the mechanics to the Rising Tide versions. This includes a completely overhauled diplomatic system where the original version was basically the same exact system that Civilization 5 had, where you can trade different technologies, different resources, even cities and that sort of thing, like you can in really all the other Civ games. Now don't get me wrong, diplomacy in the Civ games has never been particularly good, but when you get to Beyond Earth and you find that it's more or less the same system as Civ 5, you can just kind of deal with it. But then when you look at the overhauled version in Rising Tide, and you find out that the only thing you can do with the diplomacy system is set up various agreements and personality traits, you find out pretty quickly that Rising Tide is not the same kind of expansion as, say, Gods and Kings, where it just makes the game better across the board. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the diplomacy system is outright worse, because now the only thing you can do is very specific agreements, which give capital bonuses for one party, and the other party gets some various bonuses like, say, an increase to the production of science points, or an increase in extra energy credits, or things like that. There's no more resource trading, there's no more trading of cities or technologies or anything of that nature. Instead, it's all relegated to other systems, most notably the Spoils of War system that they put in as an overhaul of the war mechanics, which in turn makes war quite a bit worse. Now, the actual combat itself is basically the exact same system that was in Civilization 5. The entire game takes place on a hex grid, as opposed to the square grids you saw in previous Civ games before Civ 5, and you still have the same mechanics in the sense of certain units can only attack in a sort of melee mechanic, whereas others can attack from a range, and that can be from 1 or 2, or sometimes more than that, spaces away. That was an objective improvement over the stacks-based mechanic you saw in Civilization 4 and the previous games to that, so it's good to see it carried over into this, and it seems like they're just going to keep doing that for the rest of the series, which as far as I'm concerned is fine. But in terms of the actual warfare mechanics, if you have Rising Tide installed, now you have this Spoils of War system, where as you continue to fight, you generate war score, and if you are the winner, then you can get more Spoils of War, like you can take over enemy colonies, or you can take technologies from them, or you can take more resources from them, or that sort of thing. But here's the thing, there are 2 ways that you'll be able to use your war score to get spoils of war from the enemy. The first is if you defeat the faction outright, and the second is when either faction sues for peace. And once that happens, your war score serves as the cap for what you can actually take over. So if your war score is particularly high, then you can generally take quite a few things from the enemy, but you can never exceed that war score that you earned. And that ultimately means that no matter how well you actually do in a war, it's still de-incentivizing going to war in the first place. I mean, that's not saying you can't earn a domination victory, you just have to control all of the enemy players' capital cities in order to do that, but at the same time, again, it's still de-incentivizing going to war in the first place, and when you combine that with other mechanics, you find out very quickly that a domination victory is really just kind of a tedious slog compared to all of the other victory conditions. In fact, about the only full-on positive change that Rising Tide made to the diplomacy and warfare system in general is that you can very quickly and easily tell what your relationship is with any given faction based on their levels of fear and respect. Fear is based on the size of your military and the power of your military, and respect is based on other pursuits like building wonders or progressing with various traits, or entering various agreements and that sort of thing. And with higher levels of each, you're going to end up with different relationship levels. So it starts off at the very bottom with you've declared war on each other, and at the very top, you've got an alliance. Once you hit various levels of fear and respect, you can either increase or decrease the relationship with that particular faction, and that incentivizes you to continue to do better and better so you can have better relationships with the other factions. Now that said, if the relationship is based more on fear than respect, then you're going to find that that particular faction is going to do a lot more underhanded things against you, like, say, banding together with other factions to go to war with you, or doing more espionage against you. And it's good that all of that is laid out in front of you instead of being in the background and not really having any idea why a particular faction likes you or hates you. That said, the constant pop-ups due to that system do get pretty annoying after a while, so that is something you have to keep in mind. But even with the improvements, there's also the confusing factor of the relationship changing basically every turn based on what your yields are compared to whatever that other faction is. So you can go from being in an incredibly good relationship with a faction one turn to the next turn because your yields changed and they were far superior to you, then they become practically hostile to you almost instantly, and that's both incredibly confusing and irritating at the same time. So the new diplomacy system, while it certainly has its ups and downs, is more of a bust than anything else. But what about the other mechanics of the game? The stuff that was either just carried over from Beyond Earth, or carried over from Civ 5 for that matter, and just tweaked a bit to fit the sci-fi setting, and of course the things that Rising Tide just adds on to, as opposed to completely overhauling. Well, in terms of the core gameplay mechanics, it's more or less Civilization 5 with some very slight tweaks. I've already mentioned the combat being practically the same, but then you go over to things like the way the resources work, and you have to improve the resources in order to actually get them, as well as things like the way that the hex-based grid is structured, the way that the units move on the map, and of course, other aspects like the trade route system, which is more or less exactly the same as Civilization 5, with the exception that there needs to be no miasma between the route that you're trying to establish. Miasma is actually a new mechanic introduced to Beyond Earth, and of course it was carried over into the expansion as well, and the idea is that there's various clouds of particles around the map that are damaging to your units, at least until you get some upgrades here and there throughout various technologies, or if you go through the Harmony affinity, then you eventually gain immunities to it as you continue to increase in the affinity level. So it's something you have to keep in mind as you're exploring and settling new areas and making sure that you clear the miasma where it needs to be cleared, and if it doesn't need to be cleared, you can generally leave it alone, or if you're going the Harmony route, then you can generally just keep it where it is, and eventually you start to gain more benefits from it. Aside from that, the espionage system is more or less the same as it was in Civilization 5, maybe a bit more simplistic, where you have various spies that you can assign to either enemy cities, or you can assign them to your own cities to conduct counterintelligence, and find various spies that have infiltrated your areas and get rid of them. And much like in Civ 5, where it was a decent idea just kind of sloppily executed, it's pretty sloppily executed here, and it just ends up being more mildly annoying than anything else. A few other mechanics were taken from Civilization 5, but were either renamed or slightly tweaked. For example, happiness in Civ 5 has basically been reworked into health in Civilization Beyond Earth, and gold is now energy, and of course you have things like the virtue system replacing the social policy system, where mechanically it's nearly the same thing, as you get new virtues based on the amount of culture that you're generating, and you just continue to add them onto your various lists of virtues until eventually you unlock various additional bonuses, things like, oh, you might get an additional affinity level, or you might get an additional free tech, or you might get an additional free virtue. Any number of these various bonuses that are based on what specific virtues you've picked up and how many of them in a given category you have. It worked in a similar way in Civilization 5, but you had more categories of the various social policies in that, and it was fewer of the actual social policies within those categories. Here you have fewer categories, but you have more virtues within those categories to select. The city-state system from Civilization 5 has been changed to be simply stations that are scattered around the map, and that will give you various bonuses to certain resource production if you send a trade route to them. Barbarians are replaced with aliens, and barbarian encampments are replaced with alien nests, and you specifically have to go to an alien nest tile and pillage the improvement on it to get rid of that particular nest, as opposed to simply moving into the tile and immediately clearing out the barbarian encampment like you did in Civilization 5 and the other historically based Civilization games. You do have to be careful if you're pillaging the alien nests, however, because as you continue to pillage them, they become more and more hostile to you for a period of time. So for example, you start out and they're basically neutral. They will attack if you get close, but if you leave them alone, then they'll basically leave you alone. Whereas at the next stage, they're more cautious and they will extend the range at which they'll attack, and if you get to the next level, then they're outright hostile and they will actively seek out your units to try to take them down. And you do have to be very careful with that, because if you attack too early and you don't have particularly strong units or strong city defenses, then you can find yourself going up against very powerful alien units that will just completely stomp all over your forces and take an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage to bring down. Even worse, if aliens manage to overrun one of your settlements and reduce the city health down to 0, it doesn't simply become pillaged and then you lose some resources, you lose the entire city. So aliens become something you really have to pay attention to even from the earliest stages of the game, because if you attack them too early and if you let them get out of control, then they can actually completely demolish all of your forces and your settlements, and you can lose the game very quickly because of that. Now that said, Rising Tide does introduce the ability to leash aliens and basically take them under your control using explorer units once you've researched the alien life forms technology, which is a pretty early game tech. So you can make the alien problem more manageable, but it does take some time and effort to do so. And the last major change they made to some of the old returning mechanics is the change made to the research system to where instead of having a technology tree, now you have a technology web, which is functionally pretty similar to the technology tree, but it's laid out in a way that is considerably more confusing, and you have the change made to now having primary technologies and secondary technologies, where when you research the primary technology in a particular section, then it will allow you to research 2 additional secondary technologies that are related to that primary technology, but have some more nuance to them to allow you to do different things. The main problem with this new system isn't so much one of functionality as it is of just intuitiveness. Because in terms of functionality, it's more or less the same as the technology tree with some very, very slight tweaks, but in terms of layout, it is extremely confusing at first and takes a long time to get used to. And that's just completely unnecessary. To make matters more confusing, they also introduced a new change in Rising Tide, where certain technologies also bear affinity associations, which means that whenever you research a technology with an affinity association, you will actually gain affinity experience in whatever that particular association is. So if a technology is associated with harmony, then you'll gain some harmony experience, or if it's with purity or supremacy, then it would be purity or supremacy respectively. Some of the technologies are even associated with multiple affinities, so instead of only getting one particular affinity, then you get it in both, and that may sound incredibly confusing if you've only played the base game, and you're thinking in terms of not really wanting any of the other affinities and just going full on into one particular track or another. But the way they justify that is introducing a bunch of hybrid units in the Rising Tide expansion that will go off of multiple affinities. And all of these hybrid units are combinations of 2 of the affinities, so some are supremacy and purity, some are harmony in one of the others, and so on and so forth. And these give you some fairly nuanced units that have pretty particular applications, and do keep things a bit more interesting. That said, they also introduce a new problem with the affinity system to where you have to now get used to having both primary and secondary affinities. So your primary affinity is the one you've leveled up the most, and your secondary affinities are anything below that. So your primary affinity will dictate how your unit progression goes. So if you have primary affinity in, say, Supremacy, then all of your unit upgrades will eventually become Supremacy, unless, of course, your primary affinity changes based on how you level things up. This does mean that instead of going purely into one particular affinity, you're going to be forced to go into multiple no matter what, so you do need to plan things out a bit more as you're going on, and determine which of the various affinities you're going to stick with as your primary throughout the vast majority of the game, and try to work around that. So this does, of course, lead me into the question that's probably been burning in some of your minds since the earliest parts of this video, which is, what the heck's an affinity anyway? So there are 3 affinities in the game: harmony, purity, and supremacy, and they're basically the path that you're trying to take humanity in. Each of them have their own selections of unique units, as well as their own selection of unique bonuses, and each capitalizes on a specific resource as well. Purity goes off of Floatstone, and the idea with Purity is that you're basically trying to recreate what old Earth was like before the great mistake happened and everybody had to take to the stars. The Purity track ends up going very heavily into levitation technology, and it also introduces a specific victory condition called the Promised Land victory condition, where you basically have to build a warp gate and then pull in settlers from old Earth in order to settle this new planet, and once you've done enough of that, then you win the game. Harmony is more about adjusting to the new environments of space by becoming more like that environment and introducing more alien DNA into your system, that sort of thing. And it operates off of the resource Xenomass. It ends up using a lot more alien-based units that you'll actually have various aliens that will fight on your side. And you're also given the additional victory condition of Transcendence, where you're basically trying to evolve humanity into something beyond an individual mind and basically becoming a fully connected hive mind sort of thing. The last affinity is Supremacy, and it's all about basically dominating your environment through technological means and transcending the human biological experience by becoming more and more machine. It makes heavy use of a resource called Firaxite to produce various robotic units, and it also introduces the additional victory condition called Emancipation, where you basically have to build a warp gate to go back to Earth and liberate them from their biological shackles. And with each new level of affinity, affinity, you gain various new bonuses, mostly passive bonuses to certain resource productions or things like that, but you also eventually get access to new unit upgrades, as well as entirely new units that you'll get access to as you continue to increase in affinity levels. And the way you increase your affinity level is by, of course, researching those technologies as I mentioned before, and also picking certain affinity line goals during quests, which are a new mechanic that will pop up every so often based on certain conditions that will give you choices between different outcomes and certain production rates and that sort of thing, as well as giving you some more long-term goals for exploring the world around you and things like that. And as you continue to increase in your affinity levels, once you eventually hit level 4 of an affinity level, that becomes your primary affinity, and the various factions will react to it differently. So if they also go along the same path, then they will think of you as kindred spirits and will get along with you better, but if they go with one of the other paths, then that'll make you butt heads more. It's really the biggest mechanical difference between Civilization Beyond Earth and Civilization 5, and it does make the game play quite differently as a result. The thing is, different is not necessarily better, and by going this route where not only do you pick whatever affinity you want based on your own preferences, but the AI picks them at random as well, doesn't have any sort of preference for one or the other based on faction or personality traits of the leader or anything like that, it means that the game just loses a ton of the personality and charm that previous Civilization games had. If you go back to one of the previous Civilization games, or onto Civilization 6 for that matter, you can look at the various civilizations and know, based on what that civilization has, how it's going to act. And you can't really do that with Beyond Earth. It's just kind of a blank slate regardless. I mean, sure, each of the factions does get different bonuses to certain mechanics, meaning that they're going to mechanically lean in one direction or another, but in terms of affinity, in terms of their personality and that sort of thing, that's all either determined by players if you're playing it multiplayer, or by the AI randomly if you're playing it single player. You may look at that and go, oh, well, that makes the game less predictable, therefore it increases the amount of reactivity in your strategies, therefore making it a better strategy game. But in reality, it makes the game a lot less consistent. And in making it kind of a total crapshoot as to what affinity a particular faction's going to go for and what personality traits they're going to go for, it just means that nothing really has any sort of personality or charm to it, and you lose part of what makes the Civilization series so fun in the first place. And so much being reliant on the Affinity System means that you're actually a lot more limited in this than you are in any of the other Civilization games. I mean, to give you an example, there are 3 victory conditions if you don't tie yourself to one specific affinity or another. Because if you want to go for one of the affinity-based victory conditions, you have to basically get to maximum affinity, which is level 15 affinity. And if you go for one of the other victory conditions, the ones that are universal, your options are Domination, which is pure conquest victory, Contact, which is basically the science victory for Civilization Beyond Earth, or just waiting for the turn timer to hit 500, at which point whoever has the highest score wins. And that's it. Compare that to, say, Civilization 5, where you have 5 different victory types that anyone can achieve based on how they play. And that gives you so many options for how you actually want to play the given civilization you're decided to play. Whereas when you get to Beyond Earth, you basically get locked into one particular playstyle right from the get-go, instead of being able to kind of mix and match what you want, even though the game gives you the impression that you can mix and match. Because when you start the match, then it gives you the option of selecting your colonist type, which gives you a specific production bonus at the beginning. You select your cargo type, which will give you things like, say, a free worker unit, or free technology, or something along those lines. And you select whatever your spacecraft has, which will give you a bunch of different bonuses, like being able to get a wider area of choosing where to spawn your first city, or being able to see all of certain resources without any sort of technology, or seeing all the alien nests on the map, or something along those lines, and that gives you the impression it's going to be a very modular, very expansive game that allows you to really mix and match what you want. Instead, when you go into the game and you start messing around with the Affinity System, you find that you're basically either going to go for whatever your primary Affinity's victory condition is, or if you find the signal first, then you're going to go for the contact victory, and anything else is pretty much moot, because domination is just tedious and boring, and the end of time victory I have never seen happen. Every single game that I have ever seen or played of Civilization Beyond Earth has lasted less than 500 turns, so the end of time victory doesn't even apply in those instances. And while they do try to make it seem like it's some big departure from Civilization 5, it's really not in most instances. It just lacks most of the charm and personality that Civilization 5 had, and while it does introduce a few new mechanics here and there, like the Affinity System, which is the biggest change, or the introduction of orbital units, which are satellites that you can launch that will give you various passive bonuses, or sometimes give you orbital weapons that you can use against your enemies, or things like that. And while the Rising Tide expansion does certainly change a few things up here and there, like expanding the capabilities of aquatic cities and giving you a bunch more naval units to work with, or doing things like changing the resource trading to putting it into only with the trade routes and only if you're going between major civilizations, instead of course using the diplomacy system to trade resources like you could in the other Civilization games, which again was a negative change. It just overall ends up being an extremely underwhelming experience that isn't really made better with the Rising Tide expansion. And given that they decided to price it as a full-on standalone Civilization game and act like it was the next big evolution in the series, when in reality it plays a lot more like a glorified Civilization 5 mod, it just ends up falling completely flat and becomes one of the weakest entries in the series. And while Firaxis would certainly like to think of this as a spiritual successor to Alpha Centauri, it doesn't hold a candle to Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri is a far superior 4X game that does its own thing. And when you get to Civilization Beyond Earth, there's just not much of a reason to play it. I guess if you really liked Civilization 5 and you really want to play that in space with a lot less personality, then Beyond Earth will work just fine for you. But my advice with that is to only consider getting it if it goes on sale for very cheap, and only get it if you can get the base game and the expansion pack together. Because if you got the base game by itself, it's so bare bones that it becomes boring. But even if you do get it with the expansion pack, it's just not really worth the asking price, and is ultimately a 2 out of 5. Even with the Rising Tide expansion, this is easily one of the weakest games in the Civilization series, and only the most diehard of fans are really going to be able to get much of anything out of it. But I'd say even those extremely diehard fans are probably just going to want to play Alpha Centauri instead. Thanks for watching.